So Kirsty's part of the Research Data Service. You may also know them as Data Brisk, because that's the email handle. The service, and particularly Kirsty, has been really valuable to us over the years and given lots of time helping us develop a lot of our procedures and processes. There's a document that Katie has been putting together and that we circulated soon that's all about data posting, and Kirsty's helped with that as well. The team have also been really integral, helping us with doing things like data management plans when we're writing research grants. So they're a really great service to be aware of. And now you all know Kirsty, you know that she'll give her time and come and show you how to do.
I feel like I've got massive expectations to live up to now on a Friday afternoon.
No, it really has. I mean, because like I say, we do our best to get it right, but having that additional support. But the reason we've asked Kirsty along today is because the Data Bristol, the Research Data Service, also look after the repository. So obviously moving towards open data sharing, that comes with a lot of procedures, processes and considerations, and it can be a lot of work, but done in the right way, we can certainly do it more efficiently. So a big part of what Kirsty's going to talk about today is not only how we do it, but how we can do it well. So I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you very much, Kirsty, for coming and giving your time, because this is really important, and I think you're going to be really helpful to us. So over to you.
Okay. So I've done a brief presentation. I say brief because it really, we've been absolutely flat out under current circumstances. I think to be furloughed would be quite pleasant at the moment, because we seem to be extremely busy with people who are submitting new bids that they wouldn't have previously had time to do. So I have a presentation that I'm going to give you, which is here. This is you'll have to bear with me. This is the first time I've used Blue Jeans. Can everyone see that? As it should be saying it's sharing.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, I can see it now.
Okay, fine. So, as Angela has said, we've had many conversations in the past. And one of the things that we often talk about is whether it's archive, publish. For the purposes of this, we will talk about this as sharing data because it's less ambiguous for people. So, the key points that we're going to cover here, I'm going to move that. I can see what I'm doing. The key points that we're going to cover here is the background, so basically talking a little bit about open research and why we do what we do, and that is what I'm paid to do, so I do have to say that at the beginning of a presentation. I'm going to talk a bit about fair data. Then I'm going to go on to the data sharing options in terms of different repositories. And then I'm going to talk about controlling access. And this is particularly important if we've got legacy data where things might be a bit ambiguous. And then just round that up with how we can put that forward in a data access statement so that people can link it to the research to the data and the data to the papers. So, how can I not get that to go forward? So, come on in, we're open. Marcus obviously is the biggest rock star on this that we've got in the university about publishing open, making sure that we work with open science and we do open research. So I'm sure that you're all extremely well versed in what that means. So open access, making sure that people have got access to the papers, open data, making sure that we are able to at least access where the data is held, even if you aren't necessarily able to get it because it may be under a restriction. Making sure that you're using open source and publishing open source software if you've used that, open standards, and then also what's becoming increasingly important is making sure that your research profile itself is open and accessible so that people know who you are, so that you put that stamp on what you do. So why? Well, we know that there's researcher benefits. If it's all open, there are more downloads. If there's more downloads, then there's going to be more citations. And if there's more citations, then we get more collaboration, which is good for you, it's good for the university, it's good for the funder, and obviously it's good for making sure that we push forward scientific discovery. But also, let's face it, it's because you have to. So we've got University of Bristol policies, we've got an open access policy, and we've got a research data management and open data policy. Your funder, MRC, have got policies. Any of the UKRI funders have. Horizon 2020, all of them will have to some degree or another an expectation that you make what you do available to others as freely as possible. But the biggest driver that we're seeing at the moment, and the point where things tend to get a bit snarled up, is that your publisher will often then also have an expectation for you to make your data and your papers, the data that underpins your papers, available to others, maybe to researchers, but most often they're expecting there to be some form of open data available. And this is important because if you haven't done the things that you should be doing all the way along, it makes it very difficult and time consuming and frantic at the end to pull all of that together to get your paper published. So there's a picture of a fair. That was as good as I could get. Couldn't find anything else about fair. So fair data. Now even I look at the fair data principles, and as a professional librarian, I look at some of the words and I think it's a bit dense. The terminology is a bit dense. So just to make it clear what we mean by fair data, we need it to be findable. We need there to be a persistent identifier, which is generally going to be a DOI. And that DOI should be registered or indexed so that it's searchable, so that you can find it on an internet search or through different catalogues. It needs to be accessible, so it can be retrieved by getting to that identifier, even if it is a retrieval of a record and not the data itself. It needs to be interoperable, so that the metadata that is used within that data set has far more accessible and broadly applicable language and vocabulary, so that other people can access it, use it, and kind of crosswalk it with the other data that they have. And it needs to be reusable, so there has to be a clear and accessible license so that people know under what terms they're able to use the data. It needs to be open source software, open source file formats wherever possible, so that people are able to manipulate it, and it's not dependent on whatever their university can afford to give them as the software within the departments or within schools. And there needs to be details of some provenance in it, so people know where the data came from and under what terms it was gathered. So the full principles are available on that link. I'll circulate the slides afterwards. But just to be warned, they can be a bit dense, even for librarians. So why is this good to know now? Why do we need to know now that it's about open research and that it's about fair data and these things that you do? It's because, don't be the face palm woman, because what you do at the start of the research project is going to have an impact on what you can do with it at the end of the project. And I cannot underscore that enough. Angela will back me up on this. There's been a few occasions, in fact Marcus as well, there's been a few occasions where we've got to the point where we need to share it, but then we've realised that there's some snags which could have been solved earlier if it had been collected, or if documented, or things had happened differently from the beginning of the project. The first thing that we need to understand is that good research data management is kind of the backbone of it. So when you're creating and working with data, make sure that it's being versioned correctly, make sure that you've got file naming conventions, make sure that you've discussed in advance and set down any keywords or controlled vocabularies, set them out at the beginning, especially if you're working in a group, because then everyone is singing from the same song sheet. If you're going to be saving the data, so you're going to be storing it, you will it's possible that you may be generating it in one format and then saving it in another. So make sure that you're kind of keeping on top of what you do with the data in different stages, so that when you go to share it, it's in a format that is available to others. You need to make sure that you're documenting it correctly, so how you got the data, what you did to it, how you manipulated it, what you excluded, what you included, especially any way that you may have tidied or cleaned the data or changed the particular data set. And then definitely you need to have some form of metadata with it, which you're very good, TARG are very good at having those data dictionaries and README files that clearly explain what the data is and how it was collected, and all of the words and versioning that go along with it. And it's important because data sets are a standalone publication. Whilst they will be published often alongside a research paper, they are a publication in their own right. So if you think of it as almost as if you're trying to get it peer reviewed by your people. I saw that in TARG you've got your data buddies that will check that what you're doing is correct. Then effectively you kind of want that internal peer review process to make sure that the data set that you produce is as good as and has had as much attention paid to it as submitting a paper. So do those quality checks as you go along. As I said, I know that you've got the document that says how you should be your versioning and how you should be dealing with the data as you create it and work with it. But if there's any queries on it, we've also got a 1-minute guide to file organisation, which just kind of sums it up in a nutshell. So when we say get it right from the beginning, the other thing that we want to talk about here is consent. So getting the consent form and participant information sheet wrong can seriously impact your ability to share that data at the end, and therefore your manuscript publication. There's quite often a bit of a scrabble where you're trying to fulfill the publisher's requirements whilst working out what you did with the data, and then simultaneously going through a process with the Research Data Service and possibly the Data Access Committee and possibly research ethics boards to try and come to an agreement on how you're going to share something that was a bit ambiguous at the time. So the key issues that we find with consent forms are that there is often there is a conflation of research data, i.e. the stuff that you are producing, and the personal information that is required for administrative purposes. So names and addresses, the things that are required to contact the people that you're going to be talking to, or things like online surveys if you've got numbers that identify a participant. You need to be clear in those consent and participant information sheets on what will happen to both types of data after the study ends, and also you need to be clear about who's going to have access to what parts of it. And you need to also document how long it's going to be retained for. There's a further complication, which is that you need to think about what will happen to the data if a participant withdraws. So you need to also mention at what point it will be possible for their data to be excluded from the study, or at what point it becomes impossible, normally after anonymisation. We've worked quite extensively with TARG to come up with some consent form clauses in the past, and here's some examples of things that we've come up with. So in relationship with personal data, that you can see that this is fairly clear that it's about the information, contact information and direct things that will allow people to do the study. And then with the research data, you can see that it's the results that will be made available as open data, and it's clear that they will be publicly available and potentially used for research that's not related to the original course of study. And then with the second example, it says that it may be used by other researchers, so that's kind of restricting the future audience, but it is at least being upfront about who's going to be able to access that data afterwards. So we're quite reasonably, not quite, that sounds overly enthusiastic, we're reasonably well versed in looking at the consent form clauses, because when ethics boards get to look at them, they don't always put the data head on, so they're not necessarily going to be looking for that tightness of wording to make sure that it's clear. So please, if you're at the point of putting in a participant information sheet and consent form, please do speak to us and we'll just double check it to make sure that there's not going to be any problems later on. So that's the kinds of problems and the reason that we're going to do the things that we do. So now we're on to the sharing part of it. So when you talk about sharing data, most funders will say that it's unacceptable to say on request, because people move, data is lost, people change institutions, and it's difficult to track down from a paper that might have been published 3 or 4 years ago the data set that belongs to it. Sharing via a project website exclusively is not recommended for long term, because project websites go and therefore the data goes with it. So if you want to put it on a project website, that's fine, but then also make sure that it points to a persistent DOI, a persistent identifier with that data set. Supplementary information in articles is quite often in formats which you can't, there's a lot of kind of cutting and pasting to do it. You want something that people are able to manipulate and use effectively, and certainly something that's machine readable. And many people also may not be able to access the supplementary information that comes with articles, because if an article for some reason has not been made open access, the supplementary information may or may not be linked to the paywall part of that article. Sometimes it's available even if the article isn't, and vice versa. It can be tricky, because then the publishers have it. You're putting the onus of maintaining that data and making it available on a publisher rather than on an institution who's got your interests at heart, rather than making sure that the journal exists in its current format. That was a bit cynical, but it is Friday afternoon. So the recommended method for data sharing is to use a research data repository. There's different types available. You can use ones that are national data centres, so lots of the UKRI funders will have specific ones based on the discipline. You can use a university research data repository, or you can use a commercial one. You can use more than one. We have examples in our repository where we have a metadata only record which points people to the actual data set which is in Zenodo or Dryad. So we can kind of link it so that it pushes it back forward to that DOI. Data sharing, data repositories will preserve your data for the long term and give it a persistent identifier, usually a DOI, most of them. And some offer controlled access options for sensitive data. So disciplinary repositories, UK Data Service, GenBank, loads of those kinds of very, very discipline specific and not necessarily inaccessible, but not as open in terms of the interfaces as some. They may offer controlled access, so UK Data Service has got different levels of access. They may require certain data formats, structures and documentation, and also they may have different curation processes. Some may be very hands-on and have a very high level of curation of the data before it comes in and it's published or shared, and others may be a bit more, well, it's up to you what you want to publish. So it can be variable. They've normally got quite good user support, and there is a searchable list available at that website, so you can have a look and see if there's anything specific to you. Then we've also got commercial repositories, some of which are linked to publishers. So, for example, the Royal Society were very fond of Dryad at one stage, Mendeley Data, Figshare, all of them have preferred relationships with different publishers. They're usually only available to offer as open access, so you can open data, you can't have restricted. And there's usually no restrictions on data format, but they may restrict data size. So you may find that there's a limitation to how much data you can deposit. The university's research data repository, which is DataBris, that's what we run, that offers open, restricted and controlled access. I'll go on and discuss those a bit in a minute. It's fully supported by the Research Data Service, and it is integrated with the Research Data Storage Facility, because the Research Data Repository, the data has to be in the RDSF in order for us to put it in the repository. So they are completely linked. You can publish up to 200 gigabytes free of charge, and there is a link there, which again you'll be able to click on later, which goes through the full process of how you would need to publish data through the repository. So we use a DataCite DOI. The DOI is maintained for a 20-year minimum. There are 2 licenses available as standard. The non-commercial government license for public sector information, which is the one that we started the repository with. This is kind of broadly comparable to a CC BY NC ND, but we have been pushing for some time to go to CC BY 4.0. So that license is also available while we kind of, in the interim of while we're trying to move everything over. As I said, there's 3 different data access levels. We've got open, restricted and controlled. Postgrads can publish via a supervisor who would be able to access the repository via their own research data storage facility space. The use is monitored, and we can provide metrics on individual data sets. So the data access levels are open data, so that's anonymized, low risk data, pretty standard. Anything where people have said, yes, you can share it, yes, it's anonymized, that's fine. Files are available without restriction. You can just go in and get the files, and that means that members of the public and commercial organisations can at least look at the data, even if they aren't necessarily able to use it based on what licence that it's under. The problem is that with open data is that whilst it is downloaded with a particular licence in mind, that can be quite difficult to enforce in practice. So that's why it needs to be low risk data. Now, we've got restricted and controlled data as well, which is generally anything that is anonymised, but there may be some risk with it, or it can't be sufficiently anonymised because it would lose its value. We have a record online, which has got all of the metadata about it, so it will give you a brief description of what the data set is. It will tell you how you can access it, and it will provide a link to the form that you need to fill out to apply for it. Data access is via an independent and transparent and appealable process. And when we say that it's independent, we mean that it's independent of the data steward. Once the data steward has passed the research data to the Research Data Service and it's gone into the repository, at that point, they don't have a veto on who is able to access that data, which in part is one of the good things about it, because it means that there can never be any accusation of someone saying you shared that with that person, you didn't share it with that person because that person may have given you a bad peer review 6 years ago. So by this, we're making sure that it's a level playing field for anyone that wants to apply for it. Terms of reuse are contractually enforced in a data access agreement. So in order to do that, it needs to be signed. There is an agreement that is signed by both institutions, not by the researchers, but by the institutions. So the buck stops with them. This is really useful because it means that we're able to deal with legacy data. So as I said earlier, issues with legacy data, which are coming up more increasingly now as people are publishing data from research that happened 5 or 10 years ago. So at the time, perhaps formal data sharing was not a thing. You know, people hadn't really thought about that. You might have been thinking about open access 10 years ago, but you weren't necessarily thinking about how you're going to make your data publicly available. Ethics boards also, there's quite a fast turnover on them, and they might not necessarily have looked at the specifics of the wording because they're more concerned with the ethics of the research, and rightly so. But that it means that sometimes that can slip through the net if they've been looking at participant information sheets and consent forms. Additionally, those forms may have used words inconsistently, sometimes using the same word to mean 2 different things, and vice versa, using 2 different words to mean the same things. Or you may find that you've got one clause in one document that completely contradicts a clause in the other one. So ultimately, the thing about those forms is that when you are writing them, you may know what you mean, but others may understand the words differently. And I'm sure Angela will have a little mention about that later when we talk about archiving. So the problem here is we think, well, how as a research data service and as a university and as a research body do we solve this problem? And the way that we solve it is by putting it through controlled access. So just so that we can give you some options for when you've got a data set that you want to share that you might not have had the right information, you might not have had the right consent form at the beginning. There's 2 options. The restricted data is where there might have been a bit ambiguous about the wording that was in the consent form. It's not particularly sensitive. You can anonymise it enough that nobody's going to be able to be re-identified, or it's going to be extremely low risk. So we tend to use this one for where a consent form may have said it will be shared with bona fide researchers. That's usually what we would do. Or where there was no nod towards data sharing at all, and we say, actually, if we do it this way, then we're fulfilling what we need to do, and it's minimum risk. With a restricted data set, we go through the same procedure of working out who the researcher is, checking their institutional, verifying their institutional credentials, but it's actually the Research Data Service that make the decision as a team. Controlled data, we go through the same process. We check the researcher, we check the research, we check the ethics, we check the institutional signatory, we check the information security policies of the institution that are going to have it. But the data, the decision to share that data is made by the university's Data Access Committee. This is particularly useful because the Data Access Committee is made up of people across the university, from ethics boards, from information governance, from research governance, from heads of schools to IT people, and library people, so that we're kind of covering every angle to make sure that there's no way that anything's going to slip through the net. So they will then look at the research data. If we may need to have an example of the kinds of data that it contains. They will look at the consent forms, they will look at the participant information sheets, they will look at the credentials of the person that has applied for the data, and they will make a decision. But it is an independent body that does that. It's not made by the library. And again, it's not the data steward that makes that decision to share. They may be consulted, but they won't have a veto. Now, both of these types of data access are done through a data access agreement, which is a legally binding document, as I said, signed for by 2 institutional signatories. And again, the record is open, but you can request access via a data request form. So if we consider then that we've got data that we know we've done the right things from the beginning, and we've got the consent form, so it's all tidy and we're ready to publish, and we put it in the research data repository and we provide a DOI, at that point, we want to make sure that your data set is linked to your research output. And the problem that we have is that there's a bit of a lag, and depending on the journal, there can be issues with getting a DOI at the right point for the proofs, because we can only provide you with a DOI at the point of publication. So at the point where everything's done and ready and we've hit the publish button, then we give you the DOI, and then that needs to then go back to the publisher to create a data access statement so that we can link the two things together. So we have examples of how you can write those. So these are a couple of real examples from University of Bristol research. So you can see it just says that it's available via the repository, it's openly available, and that there's the DOI that it's available under. And then there's another one underneath which says that it's about supporting data can only be available to bona fide researchers subject to a non-disclosure agreement. And then details of the data and how to request it are available through that DOI. We've got more data access statement examples at that link, including ones for different schools. So you'll be able to see lots of different variations of things that people have done with data access statements. So that's kind of the end of it. That's just a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but really it's to talk about, I hope we've covered that we can deal with lots of different scenarios with data, and that it is very, very important to get it right from the beginning. If you want to come and talk to us about anything, we're available to talk about data management planning, so any bids that you may have going out, general research data management, just how to store, what to store, when to anonymize, those kinds of things. And then we can also do, as today, a bespoke or workshop or talk. So if there's anything very, very specific that you would need, we can fulfill that. And then we've also got a research information analyst who can deal with very, very specific and complex queries about consent, anonymization and secure data sharing. And she's also done the course below, which is dealing with sensitive data. That's a workshop. And she also does the GDPR requirements. That's Zosha Beckles. So that concludes it. There's the library research support email and website, and there's the research data service email and website as well. That's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Kirsty. That was really interesting and really informative. Does anyone have any questions?
Silence.
I have a question. Hi, Kirsty. I'm Katie. I was the one who sent you the document. Thank you for your help with that. I just had a question about when you say data stewards, for TARG, you just mean Marcus and Angela?
Yeah. Well, so I think actually you can only have one data steward, but Angela, you're probably deputy data steward, aren't you?
Probably. I know currently it's Marcus and I've got access to the RDS if I'm
Yeah, and we're looking at adding Olivia to that as well. So the TARG directors, the three of us, would effectively act in that role, even if a couple are in delegated roles.
Yeah, so because the RDSF is run by ACRC, they've got policies about what there should be, but I'm pretty sure that they say you can have up to 2 deputies, so that's fine. But there's one person that is the data steward, and they have specific privileges. So it's only the data steward that can press the request publish button. The deputies can attach the data to records and create records and then say to Marcus, actually, we're ready to go. And then anyone who is a user can put data into the repository. But I think it's probably tied down for reasons that are to keep things nice and tidy. Is that correct? I think Angela said before that everything is dumped on you, isn't it? And then you have to tidy it up and put it in nice and neatly.
Well, so the document that Katie's been putting together will help with this, but we obviously want all of our deposits to look more or less the same, to have a house style.
Oh, I
partly
wish we
for our
could
own
do that
purposes. Yeah, so I mean, we had a chat the other week about file naming conventions, and just the more that we can do that's roughly standardized. Rather than, we don't want to turn everything into a sausage factory where it looks identical, but having a common style file naming, what we put on the repository, that kind of thing. So it all coming through one person or one group of people helps with that, because someone can just quickly check that everything looks, as it should do, basically.
Yes, and so the university research data repository has got its own set of kind of data documentation rules and the stuff that you're supposed to do to prepare a deposit, but you already do above and beyond what we set as the minimum level, because obviously we're trying to drag some people kind of up to a certain level, but you've already gone beyond that. So your stuff's quite exceptional. We come and we're like, oh, it's excellent, it's one from TARG, we can publish that should take 2 minutes, rather than having to go through and go, oh no, this is a mess. So yeah, we're very grateful that you put that work in.
But I think it goes back to your point about doing this from the ground up. Like, if you start with that in mind, then it creates efficiencies all the way through. So it might feel like a bit of a faff having to do all of that up front. It's really valuable to hear you say that, because I think perhaps people don't appreciate how much more quickly our deposits get published, because they're in reasonably good shape 9 times out of 10 by the time they reach you.
Yeah, by the time your deposits reach us, normally we're just doing that last little nitpicky check, because we are librarians, we have to nitpick stuff.
It's one of the reasons why we use but that's really important. So a good reason to use you guys is that you'll do that checking, whereas if we put it on the OSF, there could be something that we've missed.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
No one will check that.
This is what I'm saying about the curation part of it. Different repositories will have different levels of curation and different levels of nitpickiness. And you've got some exceptionally nitpicky people in the Databricks team, me being one of them. But I think the thing is then it's that sanity check. When we look at something, we go, what does that mean? What does that relate to? And then we might kind of explore that particular variable or that title at the top of a CSV file and go, what does that mean? And then when you look at it, you think, should that be there? Is that sensitive? So it's just having somebody else's eyes who's we're not related to it, but we've got a sense of the overall picture, but we're not so into the research that we don't that I don't think that makes any difference, because we're looking at it from very different perspectives. From our perspective, we're trying to make sure that data is at a specific standard and it is being published, and that we're not putting anyone at risk, and we're not, risking the university's reputation by publishing something that shouldn't go out. And then from your perspective, you're looking at something saying, this is how we show that our research is robust, this is how we show that we've done the right things, this is how it becomes reproducible. But I think also you're at that point where publish. We're trying to get an article out, and it turns into a bit of a Scrabble sometimes at the end. So it is much appreciated that the work that you do all the way through prevents it from being an absolute shambles at the end, where everyone's incredibly stressed and trying to meet multiple overlapping deadlines, and they're not able to do it because their data's a mess. So I think it is incredibly important, the work that you're doing, including that document, to make sure that everyone is on board. I know quite often we have, when we do research data management planning, and people will say, well, I don't need to do that. And I always try and emphasize that even if you put aside half a day a month, so that you take some time out and then organize what you've done and make sure that everything is up to scratch, because that half a day a month is going to pay back 1,000 times when you get to the end and you realize that actually it's a complete mess and you haven't managed it correctly. And I think that if you can get that management part right, this other end of it is a breeze.
I just want to pick up on the fact, I think that, I'm really, glad you say all of that, but it is very much a two-way street. So we are in pretty good shape, but I think it is having that ongoing relationship with yourselves that's important. So our consent form wording, for example, when we first passed it through, it was passed, but then every time we speak, there's slight tweaks to the wording. And I just, as a sort of wider group here, I just will say to you, while we produce those templates with people like Kirsty looking over them, they are always evolving. So do please keep an eye on those templates and don't necessarily revert back to old copies, because as the whole open science space is moving, we're evolving, the wording's changing, and we do keep that ongoing relationship going with the Research Data Service. So think logically about your data. Don't just necessarily default to what's in the templates. They're guiding principles, but think about your data and what you need, but also make sure that you are using the up-to-date documents as well. I had one question, Kirsty. I don't want it to get down in the weeds, but it is something that of struck me recently with some new data. You know, the idea of kind of anonymized low risk data.
Yep.
And then you've got the next stage where there might be some sensitivity or there might be some risk to anonymize or be it non-anonymized. So I think we were talking when I've met you last about the idea that, you know, any one variable will be fine, but then when you have a combination of variables, you suddenly think, hold on a minute, that could actually I can narrow that down to one of 5 people.
Yeah.
To what extent is that checked, or is the onus on us to say, actually, there are enough variables there that when you combine, I might have risk, and then do we request the analyst perhaps to have a look at that, or would that be something that would be checked?
There's kind of two, I suppose it's a two-step thing. We're quite good at picking up when we open a data set, when it's coming for publication. We're quite good because we always check the files. So the first thing we do is we check the participant information sheet and the consent form. That is literally the first thing we do. And at that point we go, okay, this is okay to share under, you know, openly or whatever. And then we look at the files that are attached to it. And at that point you kind of start to ask questions. Now, when I did my previous post, I was always the one that would kind of nitpick it and come up with it, and you may have had more conversations with me than anyone else. And then of course now we've all shuffled about. There is a research information analyst, but I can still deal with that first kind of triage of actually, do we need to do something with this? But Zosha can do some really, really clever things to work out the risk. So she uses all sorts of fancy pants stuff, which I'm not very good at, but she's very, very good at. But I can see the immediate risk on it. And if it's something which I think, well, I don't know, if I do that variable, does that change it? We can refer it to her. So I would say first wave is you look at it and think, what is there in there that, you know, you have to take it quite often in the context of the paper as well, because if you've got somebody that's a study that's got 10,000 people, then the risk of re-identification for some variables is going to be very, very low. But if you've got something where there's only 10 or 15 or 30, then obviously you're looking at it's a different story. So if you look at it first of all and think, actually, I'm not sure, could that possibly be somewhere where we might be able to combine these things, or somebody reads the paper and retrospectively adds things in based on information that you gave out in the paper that wasn't in the data set. For example, there was one particular paper that I looked at and a data set that I looked at, and it was over 3 sites. And whilst it had been anonymised, the sites that were named were M, B and L. And when you look at the paper, it says Manchester, Bristol and Liverpool. So automatically it stands to reason, it seems perfectly logical a conclusion to say, well, this was from Manchester, this was from Bristol. So once you start to apply that to it, then at that point you realise that actually the risk of re-identification is greater, because there's other information out there that may add value or add information to that data set. So always check your own data first of all, get it sanity checked. And then in the event that you're ready to publish, send it through to us. If there's any concern, then flag it to us so that we can look at it straight away. But if there's no real concern and you think that you've done what you should have done, then the likelihood is that when we go ahead and check that data, we're going to pick up something that you might have missed anyway. So I'm reasonably confident in saying that we should be able to pick up most problems. And even if you haven't flagged it, we've got enough experience between us as a team to say that might be a bit dodgy, we need to get that looked at.
Does anyone have any other questions?
I have another quick question if nobody else does, because I've written on the form, can we use more than one data repository? And I've put no, and I just noticed in your talk, Kirsty, you just said we could. I've actually put we don't recommend it.
We don't recommend it. Okay. There's always been some issue we've thought about, particularly if you split a citation for a data set. So if you've got it in 2 places, it's fine to have a whole data set in one place and a subset of that somewhere else that have a different DOI because it's a different data set in effect. But if you've got the same data set over 2 or 3 repositories with different DOIs or different persistent identifiers available to them, then it kind of defeats the object in a way, because if you think back to FAIR data, it's saying that there should be a persistent identifier. But if you've got that in different places, how do you link everyone to the same data set? The other issue is, which I think is probably more important, is if we want to change the culture, then we want to make data more important, then we need to make sure that we've got as much evidence as possible to highlight the importance of having a data set. If you've then got, if you're then splitting that citation, it's kind of defeating the object, I think. I mean, that's my personal opinion. So I would say the best thing to do is to have deposit it in one place. So if it's discipline specific, you might want to go to one particular type of repository, or if you're a particular group, you might want to keep everything published at Databricks, or you might want to, you might be forced, or certainly there may be a strong suggestion by a publisher that you have to do an associated repository with them. So as I said earlier, Dryad was a particular favourite of Royal Society. So if that's the case, then you would still publish it in the place that you think is most suitable, but then you could have a metadata record somewhere else that points back to the DOI. So even if they stumble across your data set somewhere that's not the DOI that's in your paper, when they get to that record, they'll click on the DOI and it will take them back to the original data set. That's kind of the way around it, I think. But yeah, I think it kind of devalues the mission, really, if you put it in more than one place.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Or no? So Kirsty, thank you so much for your time, and not just today, but for all the time you've given and helping us get where we've got to. It's really appreciated.
You're most welcome.
Okay, guys. Well, if that's all, nice to sort of see you all. Have a good weekend, and thanks again to Kirsty.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.